Good morning, Grinders. Welcome to the DFS pregame show here on RotoGrinders. I'm Jordan Cooper, a.k.a. BlenderEd, Blender HD, if you want to follow me on Twitter. And it's Wednesday, January 25th, and it looks like Slack is down. I think Amazon Web Services is down. So everything's down. The projections on RotoGrinders are down. Everything's down. My email isn't down. But instead of going through to try to figure out how to pull some information over places that I don't know where they are anymore, instead of taking questions from the YouTube chat, I see you guys in there, right? What does Suki's back? People are like, do we need to do a welfare check? We saw him yesterday. Matt Kajewski's here. Richmond TX Slick. Give me those thummy thumbs. I figured to bring in if he was going to be in chat participating anyway here this morning, why not just bring him in? It's Daniel Hutchings, Nerdytenor, right? You're always. I sometimes I don't even get, like, you're up early in the morning and you're just tuning into the show, and it feels like you're like my dad. Like you're in the chat just to make sure that I don't say anything stupid, and then clarify stuff in the chat room for other people.
Well, honestly, I get up pretty early, and I'm in Mountain Time, so it's pretty early for me. But it's usually around the time I'm either setting up contests for the day that I'm going to play, or I'm doing cardio. And in either case, it just makes sense to throw the show on. So why not? So
do you feel that everything that you've done for MMA late swap is all for naught when they reverse and go back to not having late swap? Before we get into, because I wanted to go through a very basic explanation of what simulations are. The cool term is you run the sims and that type of stuff just for people. But the MMA stuff that I was ranting about on Monday, because you even tweeted out, it's like, you may have had the biggest edge in all of DFS for like a 3-week period.
Right. Yeah. I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, it was to the point where I told my wife and kid, I'm like, I'm going to be trying to do more on Saturday for a while, because this is an opportunity, and I do less on other days to make up for it, because it was such a big edge, and it's not clear how long it was going to stay around, right? But I'm betting they're going to get rid of it soon. It seems like not so much because it was a bad idea, which a lot of people think it was a bad idea, but because they can't seem to get it right. They don't. How do you
deal with that? Because I mean, the big complaint, even from like people with an edge, people that utilize late swap, like me. I mean, I was using it for the small field contest. Is that, like, it's hard to even do anything when you could swap into fights that already happened, and ones that should have been locked but haven't happened, but you may still get voided, and you don't even know either what your opponent's lineups like is the guy in front of me, is that lineup void, going to be void in 2 hours? And also, if you're swapping out like me manually, it's easy, 6 to 8 lineups, I know what's going on. But if you have 150 lineups, like, how do you know that the Jalton Almeida in this lineup is going to be in the same technical spot in the CSV? And then, right, DraftKings doesn't know that, like, that lineup technically didn't change, but you swap. But
it moved.
The order that it was at, like I'm almost figuring, like, how do you even do those late swaps with 150 lineups without knowing if you're just invalidating so many lineups by accident?
Yeah, I got lucky in that respect. I was not playing last week because I was in Montana. Can't play DFS in Montana. But I mean, the irony is it looks like they're going to end up doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. I think they'll get rid of it just because it was more of a headache than they realized to do it properly, to set the lock times and make everything work. And that's why if they get rid of it, that'll be the real reason. But to your original question, I don't feel like it was time wasted. I think a lot of my motivation is working on interesting new problems, and I thought that was an interesting one to attack. I had a lot of the pieces already for trying to figure out a smart way how to recompute strategies as new information comes in. So that's applicable to other sports as well, obviously. There are other sports with late swap. None of them are as clean as MMA, though, because MMA, the fights are over very quickly. Whereas if you were trying to do something general like this for, say, large field NBA, let's say, and you wanted to look at all the entries in the contest and then recompute strategies, that's much more complicated because you have games that are only halfway done, and it's very difficult to estimate how much more production there is from each of the players in the games that are halfway completed, right? You want to incorporate that information like, oh, well, this guy is going off relative to his projection. Half the game is done, but he scored 3/4 of his projected points already, right? So those lineups are great. Well, maybe not. It could be the case that the way his minutes are allocated, he's just gotten through most of his minute allocation, and it's a little bit deceptive, right? So those kinds of considerations greatly complicate it for most sports, but MMA, it couldn't be simpler, right? They fight for anywhere from a minute to 15 minutes, and it's done, right? And
nothing else is, and also no fights are happening at the same time.
Nothing else is happening, right?
Right.
So
I mean, I'm assuming NFL is like that. I mean, like for NFL, the early games and the late games, you get this little overlap, but for the most part, you kind of know what the results are of like the 1 p.m. Eastern games, and then the 4, like then you could do that. But of course, that also means a bulk of like 80% of the slate has been played before you're even making those swaps. While in MMA, like one for the first fight of the night out of 15 could drastically change how you build lineups for the rest of the night, and they're just going to go off like in linear order.
Right. Yeah. I did start to put together something for NFL Classic because that seemed like the easiest one to do after, but I don't think my NFL Classic stuff is good as it is. So I have other problems to fix first.
I'm assuming MLB would be tough because the variant. I mean, it's like, oh, Mike Trout is 0 for 3. I mean, I guess all those lineups are dead. Oh, in his 4th at bat, he hits a grand slam. He got there. Like, you can't really do it for baseball. Yeah,
I also think the value for baseball is less for that reason because, like, one of the reasons MMA swap is so vital is it allows you to change the variance of your lineup, right? Because the fighters have radically different variances. That isn't really the case in baseball. They're all high variance, right? All of the batters are high variance. So swapping off of one batter to another is unlikely to make a gigantic difference in the variance of your lineup the way it does with MMA, right? I think, I can't prove that, but I suspect if you simmed it out, to get to the topic of the show, if you simmed it out, the EV of swapping versus not swapping in a sport like baseball would be much, much lower than in a sport like MMA. Because
I mean, the range of outcomes for MLB hitters. I mean, yes, you have the Luis Arias's who are more likely to get base hits and doubles and stuff, and then you have the Joey Gallos that hit home runs or strike out. But that describes like pretty much like all of baseball.
All of the
right. And then, but in MMA, we get these. The fight is inside the first round is like minus 650 between two heavyweights, and then you get like a 115 women's straw weight that is like minus 300 to go to decision. It's like, well, one fight, it's more likely that one dude scores 5 and the other dude scores 110, and the other fight, it's most likely that one scores 45 and the other scores 75, and like that's kind of the range of outcomes for that fight. So like if you want to increase the variance of your lineup, you're typically playing the heavyweight fight, and if you want to decrease it, you're looking for like the women's MMA underdog 7,200. Can she get an 80-point win? And depending on what has happened on the slate, maybe you're more likely to want one over the other.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. So you wanted to talk about what a simulation is?
Yes, I got some emails in. right?
Uh-huh.
About like people know about projections. We talked all about projections for 2 weeks, it seems like, and we'll talk about them again. And people are like, okay, I got these projections, right? And I show these blunt methodologies on how to use projection sum, whether it be, the range of outcomes, the standard deviation of the players, the total ownership or the product ownership, how to compare the two, even Monte Carlo sims, right? We talk about Monte, which is the very much simpler version of what you do. What's the difference? When people talk about simulations, a lot of times people think in terms of like play-by-play simulations, like you're simming out the game. But these aren't real. I'm assuming these aren't these types of simulations where you're not going like, oh, it's 1st and 10 on the 20 and the guy runs the ball for 2 yards. You're not doing NFL simulations like that. You are taking the projections from a source like RotoGrinders, and then you're doing some magic. You're simulating something. And now I'm obviously not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of exactly what you're doing, but just the concept of what simulations are for the general audience that either may want to attempt to do some simple version of it themselves or just simply understand what they are. So when they see like simulation output of like, this guy has a 16.8% chance of being in the optimal lineup, like what does that actually mean? So like in general, what are simulations and why are simulations more useful than just simply looking at mean projections?
All right, so just to start, so my terms might be slightly different than others, so apologies for that. Simulation is just a general term. All it means is that you're trying to approximate something in the real world. That's it. And that can be as simple or as complicated as you want. So for the dead simplest simulation, a sport like NBA, if you have a projection, a median projection, and you have a floor and a ceiling representing one standard deviation. So basically you have, you've got I can't do it with my hands. You've got the standard.
I do it a little. Right?
Yeah. So the simplest possible simulation for that would be you roll a random number and that just gives you a point on that curve, and that's your simulated outcome. And then you just do that for every player. Now, I chose NBA as an example here because NBA is the most normally distributed of the sports in terms of athlete performance, and it's also the least correlated. The correlation between players, generally speaking, is the least significant. So that's a simulation. So if you use a tool like Lineup HQ and you add randomness in your build, it's doing sims for you. It's doing a rudimentary simulation. So basically what it's doing is for each lineup it generates, it's taking those median projections and adding some noise. There's a couple different options for how you do that. I think there's just percentage randomness and also true range. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, that's what it's called.
Yeah, where they try to fit the correct probability in the normal distribution, basically. And each lineup just does that simulation of every player and then picks the optimal. So that is using sims. That is a simulation. And so that's the first point. A simulation can be very simple. And the other point to mention is that it's quite likely that any projection source you're using has simulations behind it. So places like RotoGrinders and others, many of the numbers you see in the projections have some kind of simulation methodology behind them. So, and they're often mixed with human judgment. I know that, for instance, on RNG, there's a team of people who try to figure out what all the coaches in the NBA are going to do, because this is a hard problem, and it significantly affects the projected performance of the players. But also, there are definitely projection systems that are running sims in the background, and that's how they get at the numbers that you see. When it comes to more sophisticated simulations, there are different ways to go about it, and it's good to consider what the goal is here. The goal with these simulations is to get as close as possible to reality as you can. So it's up to people like me and you to decide like how much effort is worth the increase in accuracy and how much time is better spent looking at other things. So I have done everything from the MBA methodology I just described, where you just treat all the players' performance as normally distributed and don't worry about anything else, all the way down to trying to simulate actual plays of games using a synthesis of third-party projections, historical game logs, all sorts of crazy crap with correlations and trying to figure it out. And I've done everything in between. So I think for most people, the key is to have good projections, and good projections often come out of good simulations, I would say. That's how I would frame it for most people who play DFS like a normal person.
Right, because essentially when you look at a projection, as we've explained here, is that projection, that column, that FPTS column, is just the 50th percentile outcome on a range of outcomes. So it's like it's not exactly 40. Oh, this guy's gonna score 43 fantasy points today. It's like, no, that's just he's gonna 50% of the time he scores more and 50% of the times he scores less. And then you see the floor and the ceiling, and those are the one standard deviation plus or minuses of that. And when people come in a lot of times to DFS, they want to try to predict the future, like what's going to happen tonight. And what the projection model is doing is essentially running out 10,000 versions of tonight and then giving you, through a simulation methodology, and then giving you that range of outcomes. What happens on tonight? That's not in a, like, we don't know. We just know if this night played out 10,000 times, this is what happened. But what if the projections are already doing that? I'm serving you up a little softball here instead of doing what I normally do and answer the question and then ask you. If the projections are already simulating 10,000, 100,000, whatever, a million different outcomes, and then giving you that distribution, what's the purpose of then also putting on something like true range randomness? Why can't I just go by, why can't I just go by median projection and just like, I'm just going to build no randomness, no nothing. Like, what is the actual true purpose of simulations? Is it more that you're getting closer to reality, or is it more that you're actually simulating the variance of 10,000 different outcomes, so you're not just locked into that 50th percentile?
Yeah, well, if you're playing GPPs, you'll quickly, maybe slowly learn that if you're just playing high projected median lineups, you're going to get your ass handed to you because you have two problems. The first is that, NBA is not a great example. The variance might be too low because you need to win GPPs, generally speaking, you need extraordinary outcomes. And it's in most sports, it's harder to achieve that when you grab from median because you're going to overlap with so many other people. You're going to be highly correlated with other lineups in your contest. So in order to win with just high median projected lineups, you need two things to happen. The quote unquote chalk needs to smash because you're going to have a lot of chalk. And you need to have exactly the right combination of chalk pieces to beat everyone else who's also playing the chalk. So you need to consider all of the different outcomes when you're playing GPPs because a huge chunk of the EV comes from when your lineup does extraordinarily well, like 3 standard deviations above its expectation. We're talking, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 kind of shot. And in order to do well, you need to consider much more than just the median, right? You need to consider the extreme results, and you also need to consider the ownership of lineups of other people in your contest, right?
I'm thinking in an average player's head. It's like, well, instead of median, why don't I just optimize and do everything by ceiling projection?
You can do that, although you'll find that you get pretty much the same results. Because the ceilings and the medians are highly correlated in most sports. So it's not going to make much of a difference if you do that. You can play around with this and see. What you're looking for is likelihood of extraordinary results in your lineup compared to ownership, quote unquote, right? That's the metric you should be using to guide your decisions if you're playing as a human and not a computer. So you can have, it's easy to construct a lineup that has much higher projection. Lineup A has much higher projection than lineup B, but it's much lower EV because it's going to be so massively duplicated that it isn't worth the increase in projection to reach for those players, depending on your contest. And this, of course, changes drastically based on contest size and payout structure. If you just like to play head-to-heads, medium projection is a perfectly fine place to go. And it might be sufficient to win in some small stakes contests if you just jam in medium projections and don't worry about anything else. But as soon as you have progressive payouts with multiple players, you need to think about how extraordinary a performance do I need from this lineup to win my contest? And how far down do I have to reach in projection to get there, right? Because it's always going to be a trade-off there. Like, if higher projected lineups should be more owned, right? Because they're more likely to put up a bigger score. It's just, are they owned approximately the right amount or too much or too little? Those are the questions you need to answer. So in the largest of GPPs, a $5 GPP with 50,000 people in it, the number one mistake you see, besides people just putting in horrible projected lineups, is just jamming in too much chalk. And for that reason, a good heuristic in those kinds of contests is I need to reach for more contrarian lineups because they're going to be underplayed relative to the chalky ones, right? The chalky ones will be overrepresented. So I can get EV by going down a little bit that distribution and getting lower on guys. And simulations can show you things like, well, how far down the distribution do I have to go to get different levels of ownership, right? This is like what you show people all the time on the show, right? Is
right.
Like,
but I show a very blunt way, because people ask me, like, they want that obviously they're asking magic settings type of things of like how much, obviously we're in NBA season, so it's a normally distributed sport, so it's going to be much different than baseball. But the last one, it's like, how much projection should I be giving up for X amount of ownership, like in general? And I say,
yeah,
it's hard for me to even judge that without looking at the specific dynamics of the slate, the size, mispriced players, the combinations of chalk players and what their positions are. Like I would have to run lineups just to see. And then even at that point, I'm looking, and then I have to just make just an instinctual judgment call of like, yeah, I think around here is fine. I think like for the size contest that I'm in, large field, it's like, okay, I could go even lower. And then maybe I come up with I think I want to give up at least 6 points, but I don't want to give up more than 12. And in between there, I want to at least drop another 60 percentage points in ownership. And then they ask, well, how'd you come up with those numbers? It's like, I kind of pulled them out of my ass by just like looking at them, because I don't have a more precise way of doing this. All I know is that I don't want lineups that are 30 points lower projected, because those are just bad lineups. And I don't want ones that are only 2 points lower projected, because they're like 1v1s off of cash lineups. So it's like, it's naturally, heuristically, going to be somewhere in that middle zone. And the larger and larger the contest gets, that zone gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that you could find tons of candidate lineups. They'll all have different variances, though, right? The ones that are lower down, they won't min cash that often, but they'll have shots at first place. And the ones towards the top may have a little bit less of a shot at first place, but they'll min cash more often. And then in the small field stuff, obviously the zone may be narrower. You don't have to go 10 points low in projection, right? All these bad low projected lineups, there's a lot more of them. But yes. But they asked me, it's like, well, what are the numbers? And I'm like, well, there's no magic numbers. Like, if anyone could come up with the magic number on a slate, it would be you. So, like, how do you utilize like, you don't even use a simulation methodology where you have to pick out those, like what I'm even doing, but you probably could do it more precise than I can.
Well, okay, a couple of points. The first general point is, a lot of people who like are not technical at all, they hear simulations and they think it's a little bit magical. It sounds like magic, but the truth of the matter is, when you're running simulations, you have to make assumptions all throughout, right? There's still human error there. You're trying, like somebody like me, my goal is to try and remove as much human bias as possible from my process, both mine and whatever projection sources I'm incorporating, right? But it's never perfect, and it isn't magic, and it will reflect any errors I've made or others have made in providing me with projections. That's the first point. But the second thing is, there are two different simulations that I do. One is to simulate athlete results, right? And that's just what we've been talking about. How many fantasy points is this guy going to put up, and what's the distribution of outcomes, and how are all the players correlated, et cetera, et cetera. I get that as accurate as I can. And the second thing is to simulate the contest itself. So in order to answer the questions that you're talking about, you have two choices. One is to have a ton of experience like you do, and know how to research slates correctly, and know which things are important, and even more critically, what things are not important to look at. But the other is to just try and simulate a contest directly. So that's sort of been my focus, is to try and figure out, in 100-man
but
contest.
That's a tough problem. But I mean,
it is a hard
contest
problem.
Simulations is probably the single most tough. I would say, would you agree with me that if you could simulate contests, especially the large field ones, if you could do them accurately, it's the biggest edge that you could have, but it's also literally the most difficult thing to do?
I think that's probably true.
From an accurate standpoint, because this is, at least from a layman's, from a non-computer programmer standpoint, is that
I wouldn't say you're a pure layman, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay, you're right, true. But the reason why contest simulations are difficult is that, number one, you're taking projected ownership, and you're then trying to simulate what lineups will actually be in this contest from that.
Yes.
And you have to match the projected ownership, but also match the combinations of players. Like, you can't just say that, 20% owned, but if he's in 10% of these lineups are lineups that no human would ever make, right? Although they're in 20% of lineups, it doesn't matter what the ownership is. And then also the error bars on ownership are so wide as it is that even if you aggregate and you have this guy at 8% owned and he comes in at 14%, it's like all your contest simulations are just insanely inaccurate, because even 4% here and 2% there just drastically changes the exact lineups. So now you have to try to make the kind of close to the exact lineups, even if you had perfect ownership, is tough, right? And now you have an R squared of 0.83 on ownership, which is still not bad, but still way too. It's not accurate enough to. You'll end up with 30% of your simulated lineups be lineups that you'll like you could compare to the actual contest and not see anywhere close to those lineups in there.
Right. So I'd break this down into two things, even though a lot of people don't like this dichotomy. So when you're one, I think I figured out reasonably well, and the other I haven't at all yet. So the first is, if you say you have this 100-man contest, right? What would the ownership look like if everyone was playing very well? So basically, you put 100 Alex Bakers in there, okay? But they all play individually and they don't talk to each other. So that's one way of thinking of efficient ownership. So that problem is one I've spent a ton of time working on, and I think I have a pretty good handle on how to do that. So once you have that, you could just try and play that, which is what I do in a lot of sports, although not all of them. You can just try and play that efficient ownership and just wait for the fields to get it wrong. And hopefully they get it wrong enough so that you can profit after the rake. This is what I would call an efficient play style or a balanced play style.
Right.
Yeah.
Or a GT like your avatar, your GTO, right?
Yeah, I actually don't like the term at all because the word optimal is unfortunate. Because it does too much work. But the other way is say, okay, and I should point out that in order to punish the field, so the other way to make money is to say, the field's going to be way over on this guy, I'm going to go way under, right? Because all those lineups are going to be minus EV, so if I'm right. So this guy who should be 20% owned, he's going to be 40% owned, I think, which is way off. And I'm going to profit by playing him. Either not at all, or if I'm not super confident about this guess, maybe I'll play 10% as a hedge. So that would be exploitive. So in order to exploit the field, you need two things. The first is you need to have an estimate of what the field's going to do, which as you've described is difficult, right? Even if you have reasonably good ownership estimates at the athlete level, it's not clear that that's enough because the combinations are really significant. If three NBA players almost always appear together, that's really important information and is not reflected in a individual player's ownership. So that's the first problem. But in order to exploit the field's mistakes, you need to have a rough idea of what efficient ownership is, right? When you say, oh, this guy is 40% owned, he's way over owned, that implies that you know what the right ownership is, or you know roughly what the right ownership is, right? In order to make that statement. And someone might be like, oh, no, I don't think about it that way. Okay, well, would 30% be over owned? Yeah. 20% be over owned? Not sure. Well, then there's the range. So you are implicitly making a guess on what efficient ownership is when you say a guy is over or under owned. So you need both of those pieces if you want to exploit the field's mistakes. Now, as you've pointed out in many contests, especially at lower stakes, the field can be so wrong that a very rough guess of ownership is probably sufficient to get significant edge there, right? Like a good example in baseball, occasionally you'll see a hitter have two good outings, 2 games in a row, and he's already chalky. And then on a 15-game slate, he's 28% owned or something crazy. And I don't know what the efficient number is, but I know it's a lot lower than 28. So I'm going to go under on this guy, right? That's sort of a directional way of doing it. But to figure it out automatically is very difficult. You need good estimates of a lot of different things that are inherently hard to predict, right? So it's an active area of research for me to try and model different kinds of fields and see how close I can get with my ownership guesses and even then you need to know the correct counter moves, right? To exploit them the most efficient way possible. So I'm trying to figure that out too.
Right, which is my GPP style of like I may not play max exploitative, but I mean I've never cared about like building a portfolio of 50 lineups and like, oh, I'm going to play them at the exact ownership. Like no, I'm just trying to build lineups that take advantage of. Doesn't mean I don't play over-owned people, just that you have to build those lineups to make up for the loss of EV from that player in your lineup, while the field isn't making that consideration. So even though, like, you have that instance of that 28% owned batter, like, and people will say, oh, you X them out. It's like, no, I don't X them out. It's just that I'm probably going to be using them in my 3% owned. If they show up, they're going to be in my 3% owned stacks and the SP2 that's 6% owned because he still has a high projection. But the problem is that much of the field, from a combinational or combinatoric standpoint, are using them in very. It's that guy with the chalk pitcher with 3 of the chalk stack, and it's like, yeah, I could just avoid that combination with that player, especially. And if you don't tell your optimizer or whatever methodology you're using to build the lineups, it's just going to go by that FPTS column, and you're going to end up getting these clusters of players chunked together. And you're going to be like, oh, I'm under. I only have 8% of this guy. I'm way under that 28. And it's like your 8% of the lineups look like the 28%. Like they look like those lines. It's like, yeah, you're under on those types of lineups, but those types of lineups were bad to play. You'd rather just have 8% in a different type of lineup. See, that's why the main reason that I always preach around, just don't build by exposures. Like they don't tell you the full picture. You have to look at the actual lineups. But when it comes to the lineups, a question that gets asked all the time with like Slate IQ here at RotoGrinders, and other sites have a similar type of things where we get to MLB, right? And we'll be like, oh, this stack has a 13.8% chance of being optimal or something like that. Or this NBA player has a 23.2% chance of being in the optimal lineup. Like these are coming from simulations, but I've described how if you don't understand how those numbers, what those numbers mean and what optimal means also, and what contests you're talking about, that people may be looking at these numbers thinking one thing when they and then making decisions on these. Oh, he's 23% chance to be in the optimal lineup, but he's only going to be 16% owned. So that means he's under-owned. I'm like you're probably right, but you probably didn't come to the most precise way of coming up with that. Like that, you can't just compare those two numbers together because they're different. It's apples and oranges kind of. They're related. So can you discuss like what these simulation outputs are of like this optimal rate type of thing? Or in the optimal a lot of times it's large field GPPs, right? This stack is 15% chance of being in the optimal MLB lineup. Like what do those mean? How are those, because those are obviously come up with using simulations. So how do those numbers appear, and what do those numbers really mean if you're not using the simulations and you're just looking at that output?
So it's a tricky issue, and I'll tell you. So I don't work for any site. So the problem as an end user for these kinds of tools like Slate IQ and other sites have similar things, right? They're trying to provide useful information coming from simulations, but they can't give away too much of their secret sauce in terms of how exactly it works. So because of that, there's always going to be a little bit of guesswork in terms of what the underlying methodology is. And so I can't answer for Slate IQ because I don't know how they do what they do. I would be guessing. I can tell you what one site does. I won't name it. And this is a good example where it's helpful, but it's not necessarily doing exactly what you think it is. There is a site I know for a sport that runs simulations. So they do game level simulations using their projections and their proprietary tech. And so they will run an entire slate of games, and then they will compute the optimal lineup given their simulated results. And then they tabulate how often each athlete appears in the optimal lineup.
Okay, so to break it down just for
slow it down.
sake, is that they're going to run, like, let's say they run a slate, 1 million occurrences. So in the first occurrence, what's the optimal lineup? And it's like, whatever. Aaron Judge is in the optimal. Okay. That's one. And then the second simulation is like a Dodgers stack. Freddie Freeman's in, right? And then they just 1 million times, and they just tabulate this up and then divide by that million. And it's like, this is the percentage of time this player is in the optimal lineup out of every simulation that we do, right? That's essentially what you're explaining.
That's right. So, and I bring this example up because I know the details there, and I'd be making shit up for other sites. So you get this list of numbers. You get athletes and how often they appeared in the simulated optimal, right? It would be a mistake to assume that those percentages are the optimal rates you should play those athletes in your lineups. That would be a mistake. It might be directionally correct for the most part, but it doesn't take into account several critical factors. The combinations that they can appear in is one of them. Another one is the payout structure of your contest, right? So the more top heavy a contest is and the more players there are in it, the more accurate that methodology would be. So I have a theory, which I think you could prove, that if you had a contest that was winner take all with an infinite number of players in it, then the optimal strategy is to play each lineup in direct proportion to how often it is optimal. So if it's optimal 8% of the time, you play it 8% of the time. And
the reason for that, I just want to highlight the reason for that is because in that fictional payout contest, the only way to win any money is by hitting the actual optimal lineup.
Correct.
Right. So the only goal is to hit because second place ain't going to pay anything. And with infinite amount of entries, every combination is going to be used, which means the optimal actually will exist in this GPP. While I'm assuming you're going to get to the next point that in a lot of contests that you play, most contests that you play in actual DFS, the optimal lineup isn't necessary.
That's correct. So, so baseball is a good example because if you just, and I've done this, if you just run sims and then pick optimals, you'll be highly overweighted in your set with just collections of one-offs. And the reason for that is that's a way to absolutely maximize the top-end variance, which is what you need to get optimals. So it can be a little confusing in baseball to talk about variance because stacking increases your variance, but it
increases your variance, but it decreases your chances of hitting the nuts.
Right. It increases it like to the right of the distribution, but the very, very far tail, it probably actually decreases it a little. It changes the shape. But if you went onto an MLB slate and say, I'm just going to run simulated optimals and at random and just throw them in the lineup, you're going to have not very good results because you're not going to stack enough. You're going to be making bad trade-offs to get to increase your chance of getting the literal optimal. You're going to be throwing away too much EV everywhere else, and you're going to be minus EV. So that's an example where, like, knowing the details of how the simulation is created actually matters for what should be actionable.
Well, what's wrong with trying to get the literal optimal in MLB?
Good luck with that.
Well, I mean, the point I'm making is that if you computed the literal optimal for some of these DK MLB slates, they'll be like 282. And you look at the large field GPP and the winner is 228. It's like 60 points lower, and it's like because you don't need the nut lineup. And then also if you're playing, let's say you're playing small field, right? You're playing 300 man.
Well, then it's an even
121. It's like what you don't need anywhere close to the optimal. And then also, as I've highlighted before on this show, even with those optimal rates, you mentioned combinations. Yeah. And I always give an example in NBA where there's this 3K guy that projects for God knows how much, right? Because of some injury situation. And then you'll see these simulation outputs say that, like, oh, Giannis is 23% for the optimal, or 18% for Jokic, and LeBron is 22%, like all these high-priced guys. And they're like, oh, I got to play Giannis today because he's the highest chance to being in the optimal. But I'm going to fade the chalky 3K player. It's like, no, the reason why these high-priced guys are more likely to be in the optimal is because that lineup has both the high-priced player and the low-priced player in it. So if you're not going to make that combination, then those numbers don't matter to you anymore.
That's right. Yeah, it's basically telling you how often a high-priced player and the 3K 28-minute guy are in the optimal. Right? That's what it's actually saying. Yeah. So the details matter, but I don't want to piss on sites that provide these kind of tools. I still think they're useful. I think I would be careful and I wouldn't take them too seriously. They're probably good at giving you a general picture. So they're useful in that respect. But I have to say, in the case of like Slate IQ, like if you look from slate to slate, like if I blacked out the dates and the names and I showed you the graph, like they're all basically the same thing. It's the same damn thing every time, almost for a large slate.
Other than maybe the specific teams, like most of the time, like in MLB, like I'm not looking at, well, what's the lineup construction look like? What is like it's going to be the same for large field like every day.
Yeah, pretty much.
So it's more of the fact of I'm looking at based on our RG projections, like how much is this team stack 4 or 5 man going to be owned versus the likelihood of their outcome being above average or whatever like that. And then I could look at that, and then obviously I'm aggregating. I'm looking at Cardi's bat projections, so that's going to be different. So, like, if you're looking at like Cardi's projections and then RG Slate IQ, like they're not that. It's two different sources. Like you're not. Yeah. It's like, well, based on Cardi's projections, right? Oh, there's 700 mile an hour wind in Wrigley. Well, Cardi's going to have all the Cubs for like 700 points, right? You know, like we all know. The bat loves the ballpark factors and the weather and stuff more than most other models. But if you go to the Slate IQ, it'd be like, well, why is the Cubs only 5.6 chance to be in the optimal in Slate IQ? But like all these guys project for God knows how many points in the bat. It's like it's two different sources. Like if you did the same simulation methodology as Slate IQ with Cardi's bat projections, I'm assuming the Cubs will be like 22% chance of being the top stack. So, like, you have to also realize that you're looking, like, the underlying data of one thing is not the same as the underlying data of another thing. And the same thing if you look at multiple sites. I know we're on RotoGrinders now, but if you're aggregating from other places or looking at other things, it's like, if they have 4 minutes less on this guy than we have, like, that's why their optimal rate or whatever simulation output show, like, a low percentage. Like but look at the minute, and it's if they all have the same minutes and everything like that, and all the same projection, then you could go, hey, why is one showing much higher than the other? But a lot of times it simply comes down to differences in minutes or usage or the bat is very good at these like little small sample sizes on pitchers, right? Hardy's very good at extrapolating out like minor league data and all this type of stuff. So a lot of times you'll get like some SP2, some $6,800 pitcher that's only 2% owned that projects really well for their price. Yes. And like the only people that are playing this guy are people that use the bat, right? And then you have like a 6%. Like if you go somewhere else, they'll say that guy projects for 4 less points and is barely ever going to show up in the, and then, but also you have to realize you may be on a slate in baseball where there's no cheap pitchers to play. Like no one wants to play any cheap pitchers. which means all these lineups with cheap stacks are being over-owned and hence being more likely to be optimal. But now that if you're using the bat, you have the $6,800 pitcher, it changes. All the other stuff you're looking at is based around this pitcher being much lower projected. So all the construction types and all the optimal rates and everything is just, you just throw it out the window. Now someone like you, like you're doing that yourself. So like you may not be coming out with that output, but essentially you're running that yourself where you don't have to be directionally correct by like looking at tools like Slate IQ. You're just doing it.
Yeah, I basically try to do both things. So I always simulate athlete performance one way or another, leaning heavily on tools like the bat and others and incorporating my own stuff there. And then I also always simulate the what I think the efficient ownership should be at the lineup level in pretty much every contest I play. And now I'm trying to incorporate exploiting the field's mistakes, but that's very much a research project at this point because it's quite difficult to automate.
And to be clear, I just want to make it clear to people, like you're not making your own projections. You're literally using industry projections.
I am. So it's a bit of a hybrid model. So I sort of think as projections and sims as all of a piece. So really what I'm trying to do is get a distribution of outcomes for all the athletes. Basically, a joint distribution would be the mathematical term. So that incorporates correlations as well. So basically, thinking mechanistically, it's like a crank you turn it once, and out comes random set of scores for all the players. Turn it again, another set. And I try to get that as close to real as possible. But I feed in projections from various places and also add my own stuff to generate those numbers. Yeah. I'm not an expert on sports. Almost everyone listening to this show knows more about sports than I do. So I know what I'm good at, and that ain't it. So I happily pay money for smarter people to figure out that problem.
But I think what's most interesting, and the questions that I've gotten in my email inbox, which you could send questions at theoryofdfs.com. If you have any questions for the show, just send them in. Just even if I won't cover them for a week or two or whatever, send them in. I do answer them as the topics for the show. But people, the main thing is that I get these are winning players. So like these are profitable players that are looking to even step up their game even more. And they're like, okay, I already get they're doing what I do, right? They're at the point where I'm not simming stuff out or anything like that, but I know where to look for the plus EV lineups. And, you know, of course, my secret sauce is that I will manually change ownership to what I believe, even though that it may not mathematically add up to the right numbers or anything, but for my intents and purposes, I think I could predict human behavior better than others. So when I build my lineups, they're not going to look like the lineups that you build through RG, because I will have this guy is going to be 10% more owned because, dude, he's literally on everyone's like top plays list, or or I'm building lineups in lineup HQ and I'm getting 83% of him. Like he's going to just end up in so many more lineups than you expect, like stuff like that. But people are emailing going, okay, they get all of that, but like, how do they then get into like not necessarily building exactly what you build, but like taking these projections and going, how do I go like and make, like, for instance, if I want to be able to take the projections and the ownership and then be able to have a program spit out like 5,000 lineups that fit a certain like deal, or I'm playing a 5,000 person contest. Can create 5,000 lineups that I think will be in this like stuff like that, where they're taking the projections and the ownership and then doing something else with it. And like I could do some stuff in Excel that is really poor and it takes really long. I know you could do much quicker in Python, but I don't know Python, so I don't do it. I think that's from a general note, without getting into details, like what would be like the first step of what people could do if they want to build their own simple simulations or do these types of functions where they're like, okay, I have the RG projections, I have the RG ownership, I have all this information. I have the correlation coefficients of players to each other. Like, now I just want to kind of like, how do I simulate? We have a lineup simulator in Theory DFS, but that's just like a simple lineup based Monte Carlo sim. Like, that's almost too simple. Like, where it's like, okay, I want to be able to spit out 3,000 lineups and then compute like some type of like expected value of the lineup versus, or is this guy too owned in some directionally correct way? How would you tell someone to go about it, obviously without your extensive programming experience, of what would like the next step be? Like something maybe they could do in Excel, maybe, or like I'm trying to like, because I don't know if you do anything accurately without kind of like really learning how to do it.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I might not be the best person to ask for this because I'm a little sick in that, like, I kind of go for a super ambitious thing first and see what I can get. Making sure each individual step along the way I'm happy with, but I think the question is like, what's your goal in doing that? If you're just interested in learning like programming stuff, just pick the smallest problem you can think of and solve that and move on to the next one. If you're actually looking to supplement your process with useful outputs from simulations that you write, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I think because in order for that to be worth it from an EV perspective, it needs to be more useful than what you're already getting subscribing to a site like RG. And I think that's a fairly heavy lift for most people, or the tools on your course, which I think are very clever as well. I took a look at those on your second course, the Excel stuff. So I think it's a pretty, there's a lot of smart people in this space and a lot of them provide pretty good tools. I think, I don't know. Plus I'm not the best at this. There are people who are doing similar things to me that I think are better. There are also people who crush without doing any of the stuff I do. And then there's people who are sort of hybrid who have a little bit of simple custom stuff, most likely, but are also deciding at the human level what to do. So there's lots of different ways. But in terms of what could you do to enhance your process, that's tricky. I'll have to think about that some more. I don't have a good answer.
But I think it's tricky because it depends. Like, if it's not accurate enough, then it's not useful enough. It's like,
right.
Like I agree with your point. Like I always come back to, I think the most important episode I've done in the past probably 3 years was the first of the DFS pregame show from like in December, when I like rebranded of like, where does the money come from?
Yeah.
And it's like, the reason we can make money in DFS is because of the bad lineups. And I always say the bad lineups are either the low projected lineups or the too high owned lineups. And using my methodologies, which are not simulation based, I'm using the tools that are readily available here at RotoGrinders, right? Even the Excel tools that we have in Theory DFS aren't complicated. I mean, you don't even need them. You could do stuff manually. Like, I'm profitable. So it's like, but I'm profitable because there's enough lineups in there for me to be profitable. So if it got to the point where I needed to build my own supercomputer like you, or compete on that level, it's like that the rake eats everyone. It's like I view it from that perspective. So like, how much more EV do you need to get for your time? So if you told me that I could increase my ROI by 1% by doing X, like, it doesn't mean I do X. It means how long will it take me to do X and how more accurate X will be compared to others. It's like, if you tell me I need to spend 40 hours a week full time for the next 8 weeks just to learn something and then have to maintain that 5 to 10 hours a week, I'd be like, the 1% ain't worth it.
That's right. Well,
why do it?
Highly dependent on volume, and that's one of the reasons. Well, one of the reasons I play the way I do is because I'm a weirdo and I have goals other than pure EV. But it's also the volume that you put in drastically changes which things are worth spending your time on. So I'm putting in, I don't know, I have to look at my numbers. I think I did $8 million in volume last year, $10 million, something like that, across multiple sites.
Which is, to put things into perspective, is like 10 times the volume that I put. At
right,
10 to 12 times the amount of volume I put.
Yeah. Plus, a lot of that volume, I have a much smaller edge than you because some of it necessarily has to go into higher dollar contests where the edges are usually smaller, right?
The rake is lower, though.
That's true. It does compensate. There's one sport actually where I think I actually have higher EV in the higher dollar contest, which is bizarre to me, because the rake discount more than compensates for the increase in opponent ability. But that's another story. But my point is, like, a 1% edge for me is quite significant, like, on that amount of volume. But most people are in terms of volume. So you should be going for the huge edges which are readily available at the lowest stakes, right? I mean, the point at which I think most people should consider writing their own stuff is, number one, because they find it interesting and fun, and number two, they're hoping to just massively increase their volume. I think if you don't have either of those, I'm not sure what the point would be in trying to code up your own sims. It's probably not worth your time. Spend that time plugging your leaks and finding the massive edges in the sports that you can just crush everyone, right?
I think the misnomer on, like, oh, I need to code my own stuff. I need to do what Nerdytenor does. I need to do what the Burrito Brothers do. I need to do what Alex Baker does. I need to do it. And I tried to explain this in the where the money comes from type of thing, is that we are playing a zero-sum game, but it's not zero sum from the one, like, there are it's multiple sums from multiple zeros. So it's like, here's all this equity that is being seeded by these bad lineups, and now we are fighting for a share of those. And while someone like you may have a slightly higher share of that, doesn't mean that I can't have a share of that as well.
Not at all.
Even though I will have a lower share. So it's like, oh, I'm competing against Uticow and McLovin and all those people. You're also competing against 10,000 other people also. It's like, yeah, they're going to have a slightly higher EV, slightly higher ROI or whatever, but it doesn't mean that, oh, just because they're in the contest, that means you lose, right? I always give the poker example of, like, dude, you could be in a game, a 9-handed game, as like the 7th best player in the game.
Yes.
But if seats 8 and 9 are so bad that they're losing God knows how many BB per hour, like, you could sit there and make 2 BB an hour just being in the game, even though 6 better players are in the game with you. So, like, as long as there's an edge, like, you don't have to be the best in the contest. You just have to be better than average.
That's correct. Enough to beat the rake. Yeah, that what you described literally happened to me when I went to play poker, and I like to play 30-60 limit, but it was not running yet, so I sat down to play 2-5 PLO, and I am not a good PLO player, but I was probably the 5th best player in that game, but there were 2 people in that game just massively punting off their stacks. So
welcome to every PLO game you'll ever see live.
Right. There were a couple of guys in there who are always in that game are specialists, I'm sure, pretty good. But I'm pretty sure I was plus EV in that game because. But the DFS example, so I got in the habit of writing tools to estimate the EVs of all the players in all the contests I play. Just like I was kind of curious. And I have found several players in the largest GPPs who do not max enter, who have some of the highest per lineup EVs of anyone in the contest. So these are not pros are high rollers, and they are consistently very plus EV according to my metrics. So that just reinforces your point that you do not have to be, you don't need to resort to heroics to be plus EV in these contests, right? That's not, you don't need to spend years writing software. There are clearly people who just synthesize enough of the right information and are doing a very good job of it. So I just put
The
that out there.
conspiracy theorists will say that you're just saying that so we don't do it.
No, I think, yeah, your point is really critical to remember that the difference, this is true in poker as well, the difference between a great player and a good player is often quite small. But the difference between a good player and a bad player is quite large. And you definitely see that in DFS, especially these very large field, $15, $5, $20 entry, where there are large numbers of entries and players who are just routinely losing 30% or more on average. And you need that because the rake's 15%, right? So somebody needs to lose more than the rake for you to win. So,
right, to me, it would be more of a sign that DFS is dead or unbeatable or whatever when guys like you leave. Right? Like that actually wouldn't be right, because people would think it's like, oh, once everyone's doing sims and once everyone's doing what everyone's building supercomputers, as I joke around, right? They're programming, they got the neural nets in their heads, right? They got the plugs coming out, and everyone's playing like that. It's like, well, how do you win at DFS? It's like,
you don't.
Well, when that time comes, those people will leave because there's not going to be, the rake is going to be too high that someone like you will be like, dude, I can't beat the bad players like this. Now I need that. But that's the kind of the point that to close out the show, that it seems so counterintuitive to most average players from a game theory perspective that the decisions that they spend the most amount of time on are actually the least important, because if that decision mattered, no one could win in the game. Like if you're considering a 2v2 in a head-to-head, and that was the reason that you could beat that other player, once you slap on 10-11% rake on that, the best move is the war games. The best move is not the play. Like you shouldn't be playing this person to begin with. So really the decision of just playing that head-to-head was way more important than what 2v2 that you're playing. But we see with like 99% of people that watch DFS content that what's that 2v2? What's that, should I play this guy or that guy or this type of lineup or that type of lineup? And it's kind of weird for them to come onto a show like this and me to go, those are decisions that you could go to random.org and kind of just randomly pick. And hey, if you find it fun to pick between the 100 lineups and you want to play this guy because you like his shoes, like that's as viable as doing it randomly. So feel free to, if you want to spend 2 hours on the decision, but just understand that essentially if that decision mattered that much, no one could win at DFS anymore because the rake would be too high.
That's right, yeah. And it won't even have to get to that point. I think it'll just have to get where the money you can win is so small relative to the variance that you have to survive that it won't be worth doing. Like it doesn't have to literally get to zero. Like imagine playing $10 million of MLB with a 1% edge. Like that doesn't sound attractive to me at all.
No, not with the variance. No,
no. Yeah, you get killed eventually.
But that's the point that I was making. That once you see people like you leaving, that's more of a sign when all you're left with is the guy on the toilet making lineups. That's the true sign, because the rake is high enough that the guy in the toilet is still building good enough lineups that there's really no method for you to beat the rake, even to beat those players.
Right. Yeah, and that's I think for profitable DFS, that's what I worry about more than anything, is if someone comes out with a tool that push button generate lineups that's smart enough for your contest. Like it doesn't even have to be that great. It just needs to be better than average. And if enough people have that, then you're
That
just
already exists.
no, but not really. Sort of.
Yeah, but I mean, dude, you could use RotoGrinders tools and build competitive. Dude, if you want to build competitive lineups, you could feel free to do that. The problem is that that the entertainment value of DFS for most people isn't the intellectual. Like for me and you, even if it wasn't about the money, the intellectual pursuit of beating a game is what's fun about it. But for most people, it's I'm going to pick the players that are going to do well tonight and then watch the games. And you need 95% of the audience is that. So, like, that's the reason we can make money. So if you take that away, like, they're not playing for those reasons. So when people come here for, like, my show and go, you know, I want to talk about sports, and I go, well, then we already have the numbers. Like, why do we care about the sports? And go, well, this isn't fun. It's like, well, for the people that like this as an intellectual challenge, it's fun. But I understand why you don't find this fun, but like that's the reason why that's also the reason why you're not a profitable DFS player.
Right. And yeah, just another way to look at that from my side is like, if this weren't fun and I just wanted to make money, like in a highly risky endeavor that's highly technical, I would just work on Wall Street, right? Probably make way more money than I make now, but I enjoy this, so that's why I'm here for now. So
I've already
go ahead.
What? No, I was going to change the subject.
I don't know. I was going to say this is why I'm not so worried about, new amazing monster players coming, because like all those people could probably do way better just working on Wall Street. I think it's a weird path to get to a place like I am.
But you have to enjoy what you do. Like I mean, dude, I'm the Joey Knish of DFS, right? I'm fine with where I am. I like, dude, can I make 50K or whatever? Like, I'm playing. You saw that I'm back into poker now, and then I've already talked to people, some online pros behind the scenes that are poker people that don't play DFS that know who you are.
Oh.
Because I mentioned DFS, and they go, yeah, I have some friends that are into it or whatever like that. I said, and I mentioned like nerd. I go, do you know Nerdytenor? Because it's they go, no, it's like, do you know Pro Poker Tools? It's like, oh yeah, I know Pro Poker Tools. It's like, well, the guy behind that is like, he's a top DFS player or whatever. Or there are really a lot of sharp poker people that know really literally nothing about DFS, and and I'm talking to some of these people going, thank God they don't. They like thank God for us that they don't.
But the reverse happens too. I know at least 2 former professional poker players who played at a very high level, and they left to work on Wall Street because poker wasn't fun for them anymore. And at the point it becomes just about the money, they could just make way more money doing those kinds of things on Wall Street, probably with lower risk also.
Right. Is that the most inefficient market, Wall Street, actually?
I don't know. It's just, I mean, you could probably risk other people's money. Like, we have to risk our own money. So.
Oh, right. It's America. Everything's right the way it works in the United States. Right. You don't use your own money, right? You get other people's money to risk.
Yep.
Okay, Dan, you're at Nerdytenor on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you're always you're in the chat. Many mornings to help people out, right? Yeah, I mean, you messaged me saying, "Am I too chatty? Whatever." I think everyone in the chat give a thumbs up. Give it the thummy thumbs. Give me the thummy thumbs if you appreciate Daniel in the chat. See what does this thinks this is fire, right? He's here. Suki's not here today, right? All the regulars like you, right? Perfectly fine.
Very good. Yeah, it was fun to talk about this stuff. So yeah, Sims aren't magic.
Is that the title? We should title Sims Aren't Magic. No, we're going to do Sims 101 with Nerdytenor. And every once in a while, when AWS and Slack goes down, I'll hit you up and say, "Come on, let's chat about something." And maybe you'll give away get a secret that you shouldn't have
give away too much edge. Yeah, that's
right. That's what people complain about the most about you. It's like, well, why do you have to talk about this? You're gonna give someone else a good idea.
Yeah, well, what are you gonna do?
Okie doke. So hit that thumbs up button on your way out the door. We got NBA stuff later today on the channel. Big slate tonight, and the projection should be up at some point. Slack should be stuff should be coming back soon. So yeah, check that out. Programming note: there will be no show tomorrow. No show tomorrow. I'm going out late tonight. I'm wrestling in Lexington. I'll be back late, so I don't feel like waking up in the morning. I'm just being honest. So didn't schedule a show for tomorrow, but I'll be back on Friday, and we'll be talking more about DFS strategy like I normally do here on the DFS pregame show on RotoGrinders.com.